For most of human history, reaching the age of 30 was not unusual, but surviving beyond it was never guaranteed. People did not suddenly die at 30, yet many never made it past childhood, illness, injury, or a single unlucky season. So when we look back and say that humans once lived short lives, we are often confusing averages with experience and survival with expectation. What truly changed was not the human body itself, but the quiet conditions surrounding it. Slowly, almost invisibly, the chances of making it past early adulthood began to improve, not because humans became stronger, but because life became slightly less fragile. The real question is not when humans started living longer, but what had to change for survival itself to become more likely. For most of human history, the age of 30 carried a quiet weight that is difficult for us to imagine today. It was not a finish line, and it was never a biological wall built into the human body. Instead, it marked a threshold shaped by uncertainty, where survival up to that point had already filtered life through countless risks. To reach early adulthood meant that a person had already avoided dangers that claimed many long before maturity ever began. The meaning of 30, then, was never about how old a body could become. In early human societies, life unfolded in environments where stability was rare. Food availability changed with seasons. Weather could turn without warning. Illness arrived without explanation, and injuries carried consequences far beyond pain. Under these conditions, survival depended less on long-term endurance and more on navigating immediate threats. Childhood was especially perilous, not because children were weaker in spirit, but because small bodies had little protection against disease, infection, and malnutrition. Many lives ended before they had time to develop memory, skill, or social role. Those who reached adulthood did not do so because they were fundamentally different from those who did not. They were not stronger by design, nor better adapted in any intentional sense. Survival was often the result of circumstance layered upon circumstance. Being born in a season with sufficient food, avoiding serious injury, receiving care during sickness, or simply not encountering a fatal accident. These layers accumulated quietly, and by the time someone approached the age we now call 30, their continued existence already represented a narrowing path through chance. It is important to understand that people in the past did not experience age the way we do now. There was no shared expectation of a long future stretching decades ahead. Life was structured around the present and the near term. Plans rarely extended far beyond the next season or the next migration. In such a context, age did not function as a countdown but as an unfolding process, shaped by what had already been survived rather than what was still promised. When modern observers look backward and describe early humans as living short lives, they often rely on averages rather than lived reality. An average collapses many different outcomes into a single number, hiding the unevenness beneath it. A high number of early deaths lowers the average dramatically, even when some individuals lived far beyond it. This statistical compression has quietly reshaped how we imagine the past, making it seem as though reaching 30 was once rare in itself, rather than the result of surviving many earlier dangers. The truth is quieter and more complex. 30 was not an endpoint, but a moment where survival had already proven itself against instability. To reach it meant that the immediate threats of early life had not prevailed, yet even then, life beyond that point remained uncertain. Illness, injury, and environmental hardship did not suddenly disappear. They simply continued, pressing against the fragile balance that sustained human existence. This distinction matters because it reframes the question we are asking. If humans were always capable of living beyond 30, then the mystery is not why our bodies changed, but why survival became more likely over time. The answer does not lie in a sudden leap forward, but in a gradual easing of conditions that once made each year precarious. Before longevity could grow, fragility had to soften, At the beginning of this history, age was not measured by how long a person might live, but by how long they had already endured. 30 stood quietly among these years, not as a boundary, but as evidence of survival in a world where survival was never guaranteed. If the age of 30 carried meaning in early human history, it was because it stood at the edge of accumulated survival rather than future promise. By that point, a person had already passed through a long corridor of risk, much of which was invisible in later records. What we now compress into a single number once unfolded as a series of fragile moments, each capable of ending a life before it had the chance to mature. The earliest years were the most decisive. Infancy and childhood exposed the human body to threats it was poorly equipped to resist. Infection spread easily in small groups without sanitation. Minor injuries could become fatal without intervention. Periods of food scarcity weakened growing bodies, leaving lasting consequences even when survival continued. For many, life ended quietly during these early stages, long before age could be measured in decades. Because of this, the population that reached adulthood was never representative of everyone who had been born. Those who survived into their 20s had done so not because early adulthood was safe, but because they had successfully avoided the most common causes of death that came before it. 30, then, emerged as a kind of visible threshold only because so much attrition had already taken place. This filtering effect shaped how age was perceived. Early societies did not track birthdays with precision, nor did they assign symbolic meaning to specific numbers. Yet experience created its own markers. A person who had lived long enough to gain skill, memory, and social responsibility carried a quiet weight within the group. They had seen seasons repeat. They had witnessed births and deaths. Survival itself became a form of knowledge. Still, reaching 30 did not bring security. Life beyond that point remained exposed to the same uncertainties that had defined earlier years. Hunting accidents, environmental shifts, disease outbreaks, and interpersonal conflict continued to threaten existence. There was no moment when danger suddenly receded. Instead, survival remained probabilistic, shaped by circumstance rather than expectation. This is why it is misleading to imagine the past as a world where people simply died young. Many lives ended early, but not because the human body was incapable of longevity. Rather, the conditions surrounding it were unforgiving. Age was not limited by biology alone, but by the frequency with which fragile systems were disrupted. When those disruptions accumulated, averages fell, even as individual potential remained unchanged. Understanding this helps explain why 30 became a point of reflection in later interpretations of history. It was not that life ended there, but that survival up to that age implied a narrowing of risk that had already taken place. Each additional year lived beyond early adulthood represented another successful negotiation with chance. Longevity, in this sense, was not a trait but an outcome. As time passed, subtle shifts began to affect this balance. Some risks became slightly less frequent. Certain dangers lost their immediacy. These changes were not dramatic enough to be noticed by any single generation, yet they altered the distribution of survival in quiet ways. More people began to pass through early adulthood. More lives accumulated experience rather than ending before it could form. But at this stage of history, nothing felt transformed. 30 remained uncertain, not because it was biologically meaningful, but because the world had not yet softened enough for survival to be expected rather than hoped for. To understand why humans eventually began living past 30 more often, we must first sit with this fragility. Before longevity could expand, the early losses that shaped population averages had to loosen their grip. Only when the odds of surviving youth began to improve could age itself take on a different meaning. By the time a person reached the age we now describe as 30, their life already represented a sequence of survivals rather than a measure of remaining time. Each year lived before that point had quietly tested the limits of chance, health, and environment. filtering existence through forces that left little trace in written history. What survived was not a category of age, but a pattern of endurance shaped by circumstances that rarely repeated in the same way twice. This is why age in early human history functioned less as a marker of decline and more as evidence of having endured what many others had not. The concept of a fixed lifespan would have meant little in such conditions. Without reliable calendars, consistent records, or expectations of long-term stability, people did not orient their lives around how long they might live. Instead, life unfolded as a series of present moments, each constrained by immediate needs and local risks. Age gained meaning retrospectively through memory and accumulated experience, rather than prospectively as a countdown toward an assumed future. 30 did not announce itself as a boundary. It emerged quietly as a point at which survival had already been repeatedly affirmed. This helps explain why modern interpretations often misread the past. When we look backward using averages, we impose a structure that early human life never possessed. A single number flattens a landscape that was uneven by nature. High mortality in infancy and childhood compresses the average downward, creating the illusion of uniformly short lives. Yet beneath that compression lies a more fragmented reality, where some lives ended abruptly while others extended far beyond the implied limit. 30 appears as a stopping point only when viewed through this narrowed lens. In lived experience, however, survival did not stop being uncertain after early adulthood. The forces that shaped mortality continued to operate well beyond that age. Disease did not distinguish between youth and maturity. Injury did not become less dangerous with experience. Environmental hardship did not recede once a person reached social standing. What changed gradually was not the presence of risk, but the likelihood that it would prove fatal. That likelihood, in early history, remained high enough that no age carried a promise of safety. Because of this, reaching 30 did not signal a transition into security, but into a different relationship with uncertainty. Those who lived beyond it carried the memory of loss within their communities. They had seen peers disappear, families fragment, and seasons claim lives without warning. Survival became something understood intuitively rather than measured numerically. Age, then, was less about time elapsed and more about exposure endured. This framing is essential for understanding what comes next. If 30 was never a biological ceiling, then the question of human longevity must shift away from the body itself. The human organism had always been capable of living longer. What prevented that potential from becoming common was the density of early threats that interrupted lives before endurance could accumulate. Longevity did not need to be invented. As we close this first stage of the story, it becomes clear that age alone cannot explain why humans began living past 30 more often. The answer does not lie in a sudden extension of life, but in a slow redistribution of survival. Before longevity could become visible, fragility had to become less decisive. Before age could stretch forward, the earliest years had to stop collapsing inward. What changed first was not how long people lived, but how often they were allowed to continue living at all. If the age of 30 appeared rare in early human history, it was not because life beyond it was biologically impossible, but because many lives were interrupted long before reaching adulthood. The most decisive factor shaping human survival was not how long people could live, but how many never had the chance to begin living at all. Long before age became visible as experience or memory, it was filtered by the fragile conditions of early life, where vulnerability was highest and protection was limited. Infancy represented the narrowest passage through which human life had to move. Newborns entered a world without immunity, dependent on care, nutrition, and environmental stability that early societies could not reliably provide. Disease spread easily in close groups, often without clear cause or understanding. Minor infections that would later become survivable were frequently fatal, even when illness did not claim a life outright. It weakened growing bodies in ways that reduced their chances of surviving later challenges. The earliest losses accumulated quietly, shaping populations in ways that were felt but rarely measured. Childhood extended this vulnerability rather than resolving it. Falls, wounds, exposure to cold or heat, and periods of food scarcity all carried consequences that modern societies tend to underestimate. Without consistent access to shelter, clean water, or medical knowledge, recovery was uncertain. Many children who survived infancy still did not reach adulthood, not because they lacked resilience, but because the margin for error remained thin. This concentration of early mortality had a profound effect on how age appeared in historical records. When many lives ended before contributing to social memory, those who survived became more visible, creating the impression of a sharp divide between those who lived and those who did not. Yet this divide was not drawn at a specific age. It was drawn across a series of early thresholds, each one claiming lives before age could accumulate meaningfully. For those who passed through these early stages, survival was already an achievement shaped by chance and care rather than design. Reaching adolescence did not remove danger, but it did shift its form. The body grew stronger, coordination improved, and immunity slowly developed through exposure. Even so, this improvement was gradual and uneven. Survival remained dependent on factors outside individual control, including group support, environmental conditions, and the unpredictable timing of hardship. Because early death was so common, it compressed population averages and distorted later interpretations of lifespan. The idea that humans once lived uniformly short lives emerges from this compression rather than from lived reality. Many people never approached adulthood, while others, having survived early vulnerability, could and did live for many decades. The average conceals this divergence, turning a landscape of unequal outcomes into a single misleading number. Understanding this pattern is essential for reframing the question of longevity. Before asking why humans began living past 30, we must ask why so many lives ended before that point. The first shift toward longer life did not involve extending old age, but reducing early loss. Longevity began not at the end of life, but at its beginning. Only when fewer lives were cut short in infancy and childhood could survival past early adulthood become more common, and only then could age itself begin to stretch forward in human experience. Beyond infancy and early childhood, the risks that shaped survival did not disappear. They merely changed their form. As individuals grew older, the threats they faced became less immediate but no less decisive. Injury, exposure, and disease continued to shadow daily life, often emerging from ordinary activities rather than rare events. Hunting, gathering, building shelter, or traveling across unfamiliar terrain carried constant physical danger. A fall, a cut, or a broken bone could transform routine movement into a life-threatening condition, not because the injury itself was severe, but because infection and immobility followed without reliable means of treatment. Disease remained an ever-present force, operating without regard for age or experience. In early human groups, pathogens circulated easily through shared spaces and limited hygiene. Fevers, respiratory illnesses, and gastrointestinal infections could sweep through communities with little resistance. Immunity developed slowly and unevenly, shaped by prior exposure rather than prevention. For many, survival depended on whether illness struck during a period of strength or weakness. Environmental instability compounded these risks. Seasonal shifts altered food availability and shelter conditions, placing stress on bodies already operating near their limits. Periods of drought, cold, or excessive heat increased vulnerability across all ages, but especially among those whose health had been compromised earlier in life. Even individuals who had survived childhood carried the cumulative effects of prior hardship, which could resurface under renewed pressure. Survival was not reset with age. It remained a continuous negotiation with conditions that rarely stabilized for long. Social structure played a critical role in shaping how these risks unfolded. Individuals rarely faced danger alone, yet the degree of support available varied widely. In some groups, cooperation mitigated risk through shared labor, collective defense, and care for the injured or sick. In others, scarcity strained these bonds, leaving vulnerable members exposed. The presence or absence of social support could determine whether an injury healed or became fatal, whether illness was endured or ended a life. Longevity, even at this stage, remained embedded in relationships rather than biology alone. What makes this period particularly important is that it highlights the absence of clear thresholds. There was no age at which survival suddenly became likely. Instead, risk thinned gradually, influenced by accumulated strength, experience, and social integration. Adolescence and early adulthood improved physical resilience, but they did not eliminate vulnerability. Each year lived added experience, yet each year also introduced new exposures. Survival remained uneven, shaped by the balance between resilience gained and risk encountered. This ongoing fragility explains why reductions in early mortality were so consequential for the emergence of longer life. When fewer lives were lost in infancy and childhood, more individuals entered later stages, already strengthened by experience and partial immunity. This did not remove danger, but it altered its distribution. Survival into adulthood became less exceptional, not because adulthood was safe, but because fewer lives were weakened beyond recovery before reaching it. Understanding this continuum of risk clarifies why longevity could not appear suddenly. It emerged as the cumulative effect of slightly improved outcomes at multiple stages of life. Fewer fatal infections, more recoveries from injury, marginally better nourishment. Small shifts, repeated across generations, gradually changed the shape of survival without drawing attention to themselves. What looks like an extension of life at the far end was, in reality, the result of countless narrow escapes earlier on. As long as risk remained dense and unpredictable, age could not expand forward. Only when danger began to loosen its grip at each stage, not just at the end, did the possibility of living past 30 begin to feel less like chance and more like continuity. This slow redistribution of survival sets the stage for understanding how the world around the human body began to change and why those changes mattered more than biology itself. When we step back and observe early human survival as a whole, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Life was not shortened at its end, but narrowed at its beginning. The weight of mortality rested most heavily on the earliest stages, quietly shaping who would go on to accumulate age at all. This imbalance meant that any change, however small, affecting survival early in life would ripple forward through the entire lifespan, altering how age appeared without altering the human body itself. In such conditions, longevity could not be understood as a trait that individuals possessed. It functioned instead as a collective outcome, visible only when viewed across many lives. Each child who survived illness, each adolescent who recovered from injury, each young adult who endured a season of scarcity contributed to a subtle shift in survival patterns. No single life marked the change, yet together they altered the distribution of age within a population. This is why the question of living past 30 cannot be answered by focusing on later life alone. The roots of longevity lie upstream, in the reduction of losses that once clustered tightly around birth and growth. When fewer lives were lost early, more individuals entered adulthood with bodies that had already adapted through exposure. Partial immunity, physical conditioning, and learned behavior accumulated quietly, increasing resilience without requiring any genetic transformation. Importantly, these improvements did not remove danger. They simply made survival less dependent on rare fortune. A child who survived repeated infections carried forward a strengthened immune response. An adolescent who learned to navigate terrain safely reduced the likelihood of fatal injury. A young adult integrated into a stable group benefited from shared knowledge and care. Each of these factors reduced risk incrementally, shifting survival from exceptional to more common without ever becoming guaranteed. As early losses diminished, the meaning of age began to change. 30 no longer stood as a distant threshold reached by few. It became a point that more lives approached naturally, not because risk had vanished, but because fewer lives had been removed before reaching it. This transition occurred without awareness. No generation paused to note that more people were living longer. Survival increased quietly. This gradual redistribution of survival helps explain why historical records do not capture a clear moment when humans began living longer. There was no line crossed, no discovery announced. Longevity emerged from accumulation rather than innovation. It was the outcome of countless small survivals repeated over time, not the result of a single breakthrough that extended life at its end. By the close of this stage, the foundations for longer life were already being laid, even though they remained invisible. The reduction of early mortality had begun to loosen the grip that chance once held over human existence. Age could now extend further, not because bodies had changed, but because fewer lives were being interrupted before endurance could take hold. This understanding sets the stage for the next shift in the story. If survival was becoming more likely, something in the surrounding world must have begun to change. The human body remained largely the same, yet the conditions pressing against it slowly softened. To see why living past 30 became more common, we must now turn away from mortality itself and examine the quiet transformations in environment, behavior, and daily life that altered the balance between fragility and survival. If human bodies did not suddenly change, then the growing likelihood of living past 30 must be traced elsewhere. The answer begins not within the body, but around it. For early humans, survival was shaped as much by environment as by biology. The world pressing against the human body determined how often its limits were tested, and how frequently those tests proved fatal. When that world began to soften, even slightly, survival patterns began to shift. Early human environments were defined by instability. Weather, food availability, and exposure fluctuated constantly, often beyond prediction. A cold season could weaken bodies already strained by hunger. Heavy rains could spread disease. Drought could force movement into unfamiliar territory, increasing risk with every step. In such settings, the body operated close to its limits, leaving little margin for recovery when hardship struck. Longevity was constrained not by the body's potential, but by how relentlessly those limits were challenged. Over time, subtle changes began to alter this pressure. Humans did not tame their environment in a single moment. Instead, they learned to buffer themselves against its extremes. Simple shelters reduced exposure to wind and cold. Repeated use of familiar territories lowered the risk of dangerous encounters. Knowledge of seasonal patterns, passed quietly between generations, allowed groups to anticipate scarcity rather than react to it blindly. None of these changes removed danger, but each reduced its intensity. This gradual buffering mattered because survival depends not only on the presence of threats, but on their frequency and severity. A single harsh winter could still claim lives, but fewer winters were lethal when shelter improved. Illness still appeared, but bodies weakened by exposure were less common. Injury remained possible, but recovery became more likely when rest and protection were available. The environment did not become safe, yet it became slightly less hostile. These changes were not evenly distributed. Some groups benefited earlier, others later, depending on geography, resources, and social organization. Longevity did not rise everywhere at once. It emerged in pockets, where environmental pressure eased enough for survival to accumulate across lifetimes. In these places, age began to stretch quietly, without announcement or recognition. What makes this shift difficult to see in hindsight is its ordinariness. There were no monuments marking improved shelter, no records celebrating better seasonal planning. Daily life simply became marginally more survivable. Children endured fewer exposures. Adults recovered from hardship more often. The balance between fragility and resilience tipped slowly, almost imperceptibly. This environmental softening did not require advanced technology or deliberate planning. It arose from repetition and learning. Each generation inherited not only genes, but habits. Where to camp, when to move, how to position shelters. These choices reduced unnecessary risk without changing the human body itself. Survival improved not because humans became stronger, but because they learned how not to be tested as often. As these patterns stabilized, the early losses that once dominated survival began to loosen their grip. Fewer lives were interrupted by exposure alone. More individuals carried strength forward into later years. 30 became less of a threshold, not because danger disappeared, but because the world pressed less harshly against those living within it. This shift marks a turning point in the story of longevity. The human body remained much the same, yet its relationship with the surrounding world changed. Survival no longer depended solely on enduring constant stress, but on navigating a landscape that had become slightly more predictable. To understand why humans began living past 30 more often, we must follow these quiet environmental adjustments, for they formed the first layer of protection that allowed age to extend beyond fragility. Among the earliest ways humans reduced the pressure of their environment were changes so ordinary that they rarely appear dramatic in retrospect. Fire, shelter, and controlled use of space did not transform the world, but they altered how the world touched the human body. These adjustments created small zones of predictability within an otherwise unstable landscape, and it was within these zones that survival quietly became more likely. Fire offered more than warmth. It reshaped daily rhythms and reduced exposure to multiple risks at once. Heat lowered the toll of cold nights and harsh seasons, while light extended waking hours in ways that increased coordination and awareness. Cooked food became easier to digest and less likely to carry certain pathogens, allowing bodies to extract more energy from the same resources. None of this eliminated hunger or illness, but it softened their impact. A body that retained strength through winter or recovered more quickly from sickness stood a better chance of enduring the next challenge. Shelter played a similar role. Early structures were not permanent refuges, yet even temporary protection reduced exposure to wind, rain, and extreme temperatures. By limiting the constant drain imposed by the elements, shelter preserved energy that could be redirected toward healing and growth. Sleep became less disrupted. Injuries had time to mend. Illnesses progressed more slowly. Survival benefited not from removing danger, but from spacing it out, allowing the body moments of reprieve. The organization of living space also mattered. As humans returned repeatedly to familiar locations, they reduced encounters with unknown hazards. Knowledge accumulated about safe paths, dangerous terrain, and reliable resources. This familiarity lowered the frequency of accidents and reduced the likelihood of fatal mistakes. Living within known boundaries allowed groups to anticipate risk rather than confront it blindly, further easing the burden placed on survival. Food preparation marked another quiet shift. Beyond cooking, methods of sharing and storing food reduced the volatility of nourishment. Even modest buffering against scarcity improved resilience, particularly for children and the injured. A body that did not oscillate as sharply between abundance and deprivation maintained stronger defenses against disease. These small nutritional stabilizations, repeated over time, contributed to survival without altering biology itself. What is striking about these changes is their cumulative effect. Each adjustment alone offered limited protection. Together, they formed overlapping layers that reduced the intensity of hardship. Cold was less severe, hunger less abrupt, illness less overwhelming, injury less immediately fatal. Survival improved not through dramatic innovation, but through the stacking of marginal gains. These developments did not require conscious intent to extend life. They emerged from necessity and repetition. Over generations, successful habits persisted, quietly shaping the conditions into which children were born. The environment remained challenging, but it became less relentlessly punishing. As these buffers accumulated, early mortality continued to decline. More individuals reached adulthood without carrying the full burden of childhood deprivation. Strength and immunity accumulated gradually, rather than being eroded early. 30 became a point that more lives approached naturally, not because humans sought longevity, but because survival no longer demanded constant sacrifice. This phase of the story reveals how living past 30 began not with medicine or conscious planning, but with simple protections that altered daily experience. Fire, shelter, and familiarity did not promise long life, yet they reduced the fragility that once dominated it. By softening the environment's grip, they allowed endurance to express itself more often. Still, these changes were incomplete. Danger remained, and survival was never assured. To understand how longevity continued to emerge, we must look beyond basic protection toward the ways humans began to manage injury, illness, and recovery more deliberately. The next layer of the story lies not only in how humans lived, but in how they responded when life was threatened. As the environment pressed less harshly against the human body, another subtle shift began to matter more clearly: the possibility of recovery. Survival is not only shaped by how often danger appears, but by what happens after harm has already occurred. In the earliest periods of human history, injury and illness frequently marked the end of a life, not because they were always severe, but because the body was left to face them alone. As daily conditions softened, space emerged for healing to take place. Recovery requires time, energy, and protection. When exposure was constant and food unpredictable, the body rarely had access to any of these. A wounded individual still needed to move, search for food, and endure the elements. Illness unfolded without rest. In such circumstances, even survivable conditions became fatal through exhaustion and neglect. The margin between injury and death remained narrow, not due to the injury itself, but due to the lack of reprieve. Gradually, this margin widened. More reliable shelter allowed injured bodies to remain still. Fire reduced the metabolic cost of staying warm. Better nourishment supported immune responses that might otherwise have failed. These changes did not cure disease or prevent injury, but they altered outcomes. A cut that once festered could now heal. A fever that once weakened the body beyond recovery could now pass. Survival became less dependent on avoiding harm entirely, and more dependent on enduring it. Equally important was the presence of others. As human groups stabilized around shared spaces and routines, care became possible in ways it had not been before. The injured could be watched over. The sick could be fed. Knowledge of what aided recovery, however imprecise, accumulated through observation. These practices were not medicine in any formal sense, yet they functioned as early forms of care, reducing the lethality of common threats. This shift changed how risk was distributed across a lifetime. When recovery became more likely, early setbacks no longer guaranteed early death. Individuals carried the marks of injury and illness forward, rather than being removed from survival entirely. Over time, this accumulation of lived experience strengthened groups as well as individuals. Knowledge passed from those who had endured, shaping behaviors that further reduced unnecessary risk. The impact on longevity was indirect but profound. Fewer lives ended abruptly in early adulthood. More individuals entered later years with bodies that had survived prior stress. The probability of reaching 30 increased not because danger disappeared, but because danger lost some of its finality. Survival gained continuity. This continuity mattered because it allowed age to accumulate meaning. When individuals lived long enough to remember past hardship and adapt behavior accordingly, survival improved across generations. Experience became a form of protection, transmitted through shared practices rather than genetic change. Longevity emerged from learning how not to die as often, rather than learning how to live longer in the abstract. By the end of this stage, the human body remained much the same, but its relationship with harm had shifted. Injury was no longer an automatic sentence. Illness was no longer always decisive. Recovery, once rare, became possible often enough to change survival patterns quietly. 30 stood less as a fragile threshold and more as a point reached through accumulated endurance. This completes the role of environment in the early expansion of human longevity. Survival no longer depended solely on avoiding misfortune, but on enduring it within conditions that allowed healing to occur. To understand how this process continued, we must now turn to the role of shared life, cooperation, and social bonds. For it was within communities that survival became something humans could sustain together. As survival became less dependent on enduring the environment alone, another quiet force began to reshape human longevity. The presence of others altered the balance between fragility and endurance in ways no individual body could achieve on its own. Cooperation did not remove danger, but it redistributed it, making survival less solitary and more shared. In this shift, longevity began to emerge not as a personal achievement, but as a collective condition. Early human groups had always existed, yet the depth of interdependence within them changed over time. When daily life stabilized enough for repeated interaction, individuals no longer faced injury, illness, or scarcity in isolation. Tasks were divided. Knowledge was shared. Vulnerability became visible rather than hidden. These changes transformed how risk operated within a group. An injured individual was not always abandoned to chance. This mattered because many causes of early death were not instantaneous. Illness often unfolded over days. Injury worsened through neglect rather than severity. Hunger weakened bodies gradually. In a solitary context, these slow processes often proved fatal. Within a group, time could be bought, food could be shared, rest could be protected. Survival gained duration, and duration increased the likelihood of recovery. Cooperation also reduced exposure to certain risks altogether. Shared labor meant fewer dangerous tasks fell on a single person. Collective vigilance lowered the chance of surprise threats. Experience accumulated across multiple lifetimes rather than being lost with each death. A group remembered what an individual could not. This memory shaped behavior, subtly guiding choices away from unnecessary danger. Importantly, these benefits did not require deliberate concern for longevity. Groups did not cooperate to extend lifespans. They did so because cooperation improved immediate survival. Yet over time, these immediate gains compounded. Fewer deaths occurred from neglect. More individuals remained active contributors longer. Age began to stretch forward, not because life was valued differently, but because survival was supported more consistently. The presence of older individuals further reinforced this process. Those who lived long enough to accumulate experience became sources of guidance, even if informally. Knowledge of seasons, terrain, and recovery practices persisted within the group rather than vanishing with each loss. This continuity strengthened survival across generations. Without altering human biology, social bonds also shaped how care was distributed. Kinship, familiarity, and shared dependence increased the likelihood that resources would be allocated toward the vulnerable. While scarcity still imposed limits, the threshold at which an individual was left unsupported shifted. Survival no longer hinged solely on physical capacity, but on social integration. To belong was to be buffered. These dynamics altered the meaning of age. Living past 30 became less remarkable not because danger vanished, but because fewer individuals were forced to face danger alone, survival gained a social dimension. Endurance became something sustained by shared effort rather than individual resilience. This stage of the story reveals why longevity cannot be understood without community. The human body did not change, but its chances did. Cooperation reduced the finality of misfortune, turning many fatal events into survivable ones. 30 ceased to stand as a solitary threshold and began to emerge as a point more lives could approach together. Yet cooperation alone was not sufficient. Shared life created new vulnerabilities as well as protections. To understand how longevity continued to develop, we must examine how communities managed both care and risk, and how living together reshaped the conditions under which survival could continue to accumulate. Living together did more than provide immediate assistance during moments of weakness. It gradually changed how risk was anticipated, remembered, and avoided. Within a group, danger was no longer encountered as a series of isolated surprises. Patterns began to emerge through shared experience, allowing communities to respond before harm fully unfolded. This shift did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced how often survival depended on chance alone. As groups persisted across seasons and generations, collective memory took shape. Individuals remembered injuries, failed hunts, dangerous routes, and harsh winters. These memories were carried in habits rather than stories, in where people chose to camp when they chose to move, and which behaviors quietly faded away. Risk became something managed indirectly, guided by accumulated experience rather than conscious calculation. Care within these groups also evolved beyond immediate crisis response. When illness or injury occurred, support often extended beyond the first moment of danger. The sick were not only fed but protected from further exposure. The injured were not only helped once but relieved from tasks that could worsen their condition. This continuity of care mattered because many fatal outcomes resulted not from the initial event, but from repeated strain during recovery. By interrupting that strain, communities widened the space in which healing could occur. This redistribution of effort altered the trajectory of many lives. Individuals who might have succumbed to prolonged weakness instead recovered slowly. Time became a resource shared by the group. One person's reduced contribution was balanced by others, allowing survival to continue without immediate cost to the collective. Over time, this flexibility reduced the frequency with which vulnerability translated into death. These changes also influenced how energy was spent across a lifetime. In solitary survival, every individual must constantly operate near their limits. Within a cooperative group, effort could be modulated. Periods of rest became possible without immediate consequence. This modulation preserved strength and reduced cumulative damage to the body. Longevity benefited not from increased vigor, but from reduced exhaustion. Importantly, these dynamics did not require equality or idealized cooperation. Support was uneven and often constrained by scarcity, yet even limited cooperation produced measurable effects. Small increases in recovery rates, modest reductions in fatal neglect, and slightly improved protection during vulnerability accumulated over time. Survival curves shifted quietly, altering who lived long enough to age at all. As more individuals survived into later adulthood, the structure of communities changed in return. Groups with a wider range of ages carried broader experience. Older individuals did not dominate survival, but they contributed to stability through memory and continuity. Their presence reinforced practices that reduced unnecessary risk, creating feedback loops that further improved survival odds for younger members. This reciprocal relationship between community and longevity reveals why living past 30 became more common without anyone noticing. No rule was rewritten, no boundary was crossed. Survival simply became less brittle. The loss of a single individual no longer erased accumulated knowledge. Care extended beyond emergencies. Risk was distributed rather than concentrated. Yet these social structures also introduced new challenges. Crowded living, increased disease transmission, dependence created vulnerability to group failure. Longevity advanced alongside new forms of fragility. To understand how humans continue to navigate this balance, we must look at how communities refined their internal organization and adapted to the pressures created by living closely together. As cooperation became more embedded in daily life, human communities began to develop a subtle form of stability that had rarely existed before. This stability did not eliminate danger, but it reduced how abruptly life could unravel. Survival no longer depended solely on immediate strength or constant alertness. Instead, it became supported by shared routines that absorbed shock and softened loss. With repeated interaction came predictability. Tasks followed familiar rhythms. Roles emerged naturally based on ability and experience. When individuals knew what was expected of them and what they could expect from others, fewer risks arose from confusion or miscalculation. This predictability lowered the frequency of unnecessary danger, preserving energy that could be redirected toward endurance rather than constant reaction. Such structure also allowed communities to adapt when conditions changed. Scarcity, illness, or environmental stress no longer forced instant collapse. Groups adjusted by redistributing effort, altering movement patterns, or reducing exposure collectively. These responses were imperfect, yet they extended survival long enough for recovery to occur. Time, once scarce, became slightly more available. The presence of multiple generations further reinforced this stability. When individuals lived long enough to witness cycles of hardship and recovery, experience accumulated across decades rather than seasons. This accumulation did not grant control over nature, but it improved judgment. Choices became less reactive and more informed by memory. Longevity benefited from this restraint, as fewer lives were lost to repeated mistakes. Importantly, this stage did not mark a transition to comfort or security. Communities remained vulnerable to disease, conflict, and environmental extremes. What changed was the speed at which vulnerability translated into death. Loss became less immediate. Survival gained duration. This shift allowed age to accumulate gradually, without drawing attention to itself. As a result, living past 30 began to feel less like an anomaly and more like a continuation. Not because 30 lost its meaning, but because more lives reached it without interruption. The boundary softened, not through intention, but through habit. Daily life, structured by cooperation, reduced the sharp edges that once cut lives short. This did not mean that everyone benefited equally. Power, access to resources, and social bonds continued to shape outcomes. Yet even uneven stability altered survival patterns across populations. Small advantages multiplied over time, creating broader distributions of age within groups. Longevity expanded quietly, embedded within social organization rather than announced through change. By the end of this phase, the foundations of longer life were firmly social. Environment had softened, recovery had become possible, and cooperation had redistributed risk. Together, these factors transformed survival from a solitary struggle into a shared process. 30 no longer stood alone as a fragile threshold. It became part of a longer continuum of lived experience. This completes the role of community in the early emergence of human longevity. Survival had become something humans could sustain together, even in a world that remained uncertain. To understand how longevity continued to extend beyond this point, we must now turn to the slow rise of stability itself, how patterns of living became more predictable over generations, and how this predictability further reduced the randomness that once governed human life. As cooperation stabilized daily life, another quiet transformation began to take shape. Predictability. Survival had long been governed by randomness, by events that arrived without warning and demanded immediate response. Over time, however, human life became slightly less reactive and slightly more anticipatory. This shift did not remove uncertainty, but it altered how often existence was thrown into crisis. With fewer surprises, survival gained continuity, and continuity allowed age to extend forward. Predictability emerged first through rhythm. Seasonal cycles became familiar rather than threatening. Communities learned when food would likely be scarce and when it might return. Movement followed patterns shaped by memory rather than urgency. These rhythms did not guarantee success, but they reduced the shock of change. Bodies that were not constantly pushed into emergency conserved strength, making recovery from hardship more likely. The repetition of daily tasks also mattered. When activities followed known sequences, the likelihood of fatal error declined. Familiar tools were handled with greater care. Paths were chosen with accumulated caution. Habits replaced improvisation. This reduction in novelty lowered the rate of accidents that had once claimed lives without warning. Survival improved not through innovation, but through consistency. This growing predictability altered how risk was distributed across time. Instead of clustering into sudden, overwhelming episodes, danger became spread out. A difficult season might still arrive, but it was approached with preparation rather than surprise. Illness still occurred, but bodies entered it better nourished and less exhausted. Injury still happened, but recovery was supported by routines that allowed rest and protection. Longevity benefited from this smoothing of extremes. Importantly, predictability did not imply comfort. Life remained demanding, and resources were often scarce. Yet the absence of constant crisis changed how energy was used. Less effort was spent reacting, and more could be preserved for endurance. Over years and generations, this conservation of energy reduced cumulative damage to the body. Wear and tear slowed, not because the body became stronger, but because it was less frequently overwhelmed. This shift also influenced how age was experienced. When life was governed by constant unpredictability, long-term survival felt abstract. When patterns emerged, continuity became imaginable. Individuals who lived through repeated cycles of hardship and recovery gained a sense of persistence. Age accumulated not as a count of years, but as a record of having remained through change. Predictability further reinforced social stability. Shared expectations reduced conflict and misalignment within groups. Cooperation became easier when outcomes were less volatile. This ease strengthened the structures that supported survival in the first place, creating feedback loops that quietly favored longevity. What makes this stage difficult to locate in history is its subtlety. There was no moment when humans decided to live predictably. Patterns emerged gradually through repetition and selection. Practices that reduced risk persisted. Those that heightened danger faded. Over time, life became marginally more navigable, even as uncertainty remained. As predictability increased, the odds of surviving into later adulthood improved without drawing attention. 30 no longer stood as a distant threshold reached by chance alone. It became part of a longer arc shaped by accumulated routine. Longevity emerged not from extending life's end, but from stabilizing its middle. This stage marks a turning point in how survival was experienced. The world remained imperfect and demanding, yet it became less erratic. For the first time, survival could be sustained across years rather than moments. To understand how this predictability continued to deepen and how it further reshaped human life, we must look next at how humans began to anchor stability more firmly through changes in subsistence and settlement. As predictability deepened, it began to anchor itself not only in habits, but in place. Human life slowly shifted from constant movement toward repeated return. Campsites became familiar. Territories were revisited. Certain locations began to hold memory rather than serving as temporary refuge. This gradual attachment to place did not emerge as a decision to settle, but as a practical response to reduced uncertainty. Where survival was more likely, return made sense. This change altered the rhythm of risk. Constant movement exposed bodies to unfamiliar terrain, unknown pathogens, and unpredictable encounters. Returning to known locations reduced these hazards. Groups learned where water was safest, where shelter held best against weather, and where food could be found with less effort. Familiarity replaced exploration. Survival benefited not from discovery, but from repetition. With repeated return came subtle forms of preparation. Even without permanent structures, humans began to anticipate future needs. Shelters were improved incrementally, tools were stored rather than discarded. Fire sites were reused. These practices reduced the energy cost of restarting life after each movement. Conservation of effort preserved strength, allowing bodies to recover more fully between periods of stress. Food acquisition followed similar patterns. As knowledge of local resources accumulated, reliance on chance diminished. Certain plants, animals, or seasonal opportunities became predictable. While scarcity remained a constant threat, its timing became less surprising. Bodies that were not caught repeatedly in extreme deprivation maintained stronger defenses against illness and injury. Survival extended not because abundance appeared, but because volatility decreased. This anchoring of life also affected social structure. When groups returned to the same places, relationships stabilized. Cooperation became more reliable. Shared responsibility for space increased. Conflict decreased, not because tension vanished, but because predictability reduced misunderstanding. These social effects further lowered risk, reinforcing the conditions that supported longevity. Importantly, this phase did not mark the rise of agriculture or permanent settlement. It preceded those developments by emphasizing familiarity over control. Humans did not yet dominate their environment. They learned instead how to align with it. By returning to places that had already proven survivable, they reduced the number of unknown variables pressing against survival. This alignment altered how bodies aged. Fewer extreme shocks meant less cumulative damage. Recovery from hardship became more complete. Individuals carried strength forward rather than constantly rebuilding it. Over time, this continuity allowed age to accumulate with fewer interruptions. Living past 30 became less dependent on rare fortune and more on sustained routine. The effects of this shift were uneven and slow. Some groups experienced greater stability, others remained highly mobile. Longevity did not rise uniformly. Yet wherever predictability anchored survival, age extended quietly. 30 became reachable not because life was easy, but because it was less chaotic. What is striking is how little awareness accompanied this transformation. No generation announced that life had become more stable. People responded to what worked, repeating behaviors that reduced loss. Over time, these repetitions reshaped survival patterns without altering how life was consciously understood. As stability took root in place and practice, the groundwork was laid for deeper forms of predictability. Survival had moved from moment-to-moment reaction toward continuity across seasons and years. To see how this continuity continued to grow and how it further reduced the randomness that once governed human life, we must next examine how humans began to manage resources and time with increasing foresight. As life became anchored in familiar places and repeated routines, humans began to develop a new relationship with time itself. Survival no longer unfolded entirely in reaction to immediate threat. Instead, it started to include short horizons of anticipation. This change did not require abstract planning or long-term vision. It emerged naturally from repetition, when the future resembled the past closely enough to be imagined at all. Managing resources became a quiet extension of predictability. When food sources followed seasonal rhythms, people learned not only where to find them, but when. This knowledge reduced waste and softened periods of scarcity. Even minimal forms of storage, drying, sharing, or delayed consumption altered survival outcomes. Bodies that avoided repeated cycles of extreme deprivation maintained greater resilience against illness and injury. Longevity benefited not from abundance, but from moderation. Time itself became less compressed. In a world governed by constant crisis, the future collapses into the present. When predictability increased, moments could stretch forward. Recovery was no longer rushed. Decisions could be delayed. Risk could be spaced out. This spacing mattered because it reduced cumulative strain on the body. Stress that once arrived in overlapping waves began to separate into manageable intervals. These changes also influenced how effort was allocated across a lifetime. Instead of expending maximum energy at all times, individuals could adjust output according to need. Periods of intense labor were followed by rest. This rhythm preserved strength and reduced long-term damage. Aging slowed not because bodies were spared hardship, but because hardship was no longer continuous. The management of time and resources further reinforced social cooperation. Shared expectations about when to gather food, when to rest, and how to respond to scarcity reduced conflict. Coordination improved. Groups functioned with fewer internal disruptions, allowing energy to be directed outward toward survival rather than inward toward tension. This internal stability indirectly supported longevity by conserving physical and psychological reserves. What makes this stage particularly important is that it marks the transition from survival as endurance to survival as continuity. Life no longer depended solely on withstanding isolated trials. It became sustained across repeated cycles. Age accumulated quietly as individuals remained present through changing seasons rather than being removed by repeated shock. 30, within this context, lost much of its earlier fragility. It did not become safe, but it became reachable with greater regularity. The path toward it contained fewer abrupt collapses. Survival smoothed into a longer arc, shaped by habit and foresight rather than constant reaction. This did not mean that life had become secure or predictable in the modern sense. Uncertainty remained a defining feature of human existence. Yet the nature of uncertainty changed. It became something navigated rather than endured blindly. This navigation reduced the density of fatal outcomes without eliminating risk itself. By the end of this phase, the foundations of longevity were firmly embedded in how humans organized time, space, and effort. What changed was the structure through which life moved. Survival gained continuity, and continuity allowed age to extend forward without drawing attention to itself. This completes the role of predictability in the slow emergence of human longevity. To understand how living past 30 continued to become more common, we must now look beyond stability alone and examine how deeper shifts in subsistence and daily sustenance further reduced vulnerability across generations. As predictability stabilized daily life and reduced the sharpest edges of beyond survival, another layer quietly reshaped human longevity, the way humans sustained themselves. Subsistence was never merely about obtaining food. It defined how often bodies were pushed into weakness, how frequently energy reserves were depleted, and how vulnerable individuals became to illness and injury. When subsistence practices began to change, survival patterns shifted with them. Early human diets were shaped by uncertainty. Food availability fluctuated widely, forcing bodies into repeated cycles of abundance and deprivation. These oscillations placed significant strain on physical resilience. Periods of hunger weakened immune responses, slowed healing, and reduced tolerance to stress. The cumulative effect of repeated scarcity shortened lives not by limiting their potential length, but by increasing the likelihood of early failure. Over time, subsistence strategies became slightly more reliable. This reliability did not imply consistent abundance. It emerged instead through diversification. By relying on a wider range of food sources, humans reduced dependence on any single resource. When one source failed, others remained. This buffering lowered the frequency of extreme deprivation, allowing bodies to maintain baseline strength more often. Food preparation further amplified this effect. Cooking, processing, and sharing altered not only what was eaten, but how efficiently energy was extracted. Digestive effort decreased. Nutrient absorption improved. Bodies spent less energy breaking down food and more maintaining tissue and immunity. These changes did not eliminate malnutrition, but they softened its impact, especially during vulnerable stages of life. Subsistence also shaped daily effort. The energy required to obtain food determined how much remained for recovery and growth. As methods became more efficient, the constant drain on the body lessened. Reduced exhaustion lowered the risk of injury and improved resistance to disease. Survival extended not because food became plentiful, but because effort became more sustainable. This sustainability mattered most during periods of stress. When illness struck or injury occurred, individuals with greater energy reserves endured longer. Recovery became more likely when bodies were not already operating at their limits. In this way, subsistence practices indirectly widened the margin between survival and collapse. Importantly, these shifts did not arise from conscious attempts to live longer. They emerged from necessity. Groups that balanced effort and reward more effectively lost fewer members. Practices that reduced exhaustion persisted. Over generations, these patterns reshaped survival without altering human anatomy. As subsistence stabilized, age began to accumulate with fewer interruptions. 30 became less exceptional not because danger vanished, but because fewer lives were undermined by repeated nutritional stress. Bodies reached adulthood with greater resilience, and that resilience carried forward into later years. This phase reveals how longevity is tied to maintenance rather than extension. Survival depends not only on avoiding catastrophe, but on sustaining strength between crises. When subsistence reduced the frequency and severity of weakness, life extended quietly. Yet subsistence alone could not ensure continuity. Even with improved nourishment, bodies remained vulnerable to sudden loss. To understand how living past 30 continued to become more common, we must examine how subsistence practices interacted with social structure and knowledge, creating systems that further stabilized survival across generations. As subsistence became more reliable, its effects extended beyond nourishment into the realm of knowledge. Survival was no longer shaped only by what was eaten, but by what was remembered. Each successful strategy for finding, preparing, and sharing food carried information that could be reused. Over time, this accumulation of practical knowledge reduced uncertainty, allowing groups to avoid repeating failures that had once cost lives. Knowledge transformed subsistence by narrowing the gap between effort and reward. When people understood which foods were safe, which were seasonal, and which required preparation, poisoning, starvation, and wasted energy declined. Not because danger vanished, but because experience filtered choices. Survival benefited from this filtering, as bodies were less frequently exposed to unnecessary risk. This transfer of knowledge was rarely formal. It occurred through observation, imitation, and habit. Younger members learned by watching elders prepare food, choose routes, and time activities. These patterns persisted not because they were understood abstractly, but because they worked. Over generations, effective practices became embedded in daily life, shaping survival without conscious design. The presence of individuals who had lived longer played a critical role in this process. Those who reached later adulthood carried memories of past scarcity and recovery. Their experience informed decisions about when to move, what to consume, and how to respond to stress. Longevity reinforced subsistence stability by preserving this memory within the group. Survival, in turn, supported longevity by allowing memory to persist. This feedback loop altered how risk accumulated across a lifetime. Instead of confronting each challenge anew, individuals encountered familiar situations with inherited responses. This reduced the physical and psychological cost of adaptation. Bodies conserved energy, and stress responses became more measured. Longevity emerged not from eliminating hardship, but from reducing its novelty. Subsistence knowledge also shaped social roles. As expertise differentiated, individuals contributed in ways that matched ability rather than strength alone. Older members could guide, prepare, or coordinate rather than compete physically. Age ceased to be a liability as long as experience remained useful. Importantly, these developments did not create equality or security. Scarcity still imposed limits. Knowledge could fail under unprecedented conditions. Yet even partial understanding reduced fatal error. Fewer lives were lost to avoidable mistakes. More individuals carried strength and memory forward. As subsistence practices stabilized through shared knowledge, the distribution of survival shifted again. Fewer lives were undermined by ignorance. More reached adulthood with skills that reduced risk. 30 became reachable with greater consistency, not because life was easier, but because it was less blind. This stage highlights how longevity depends on continuity of information as much as continuity of food. Survival improved when experience accumulated, rather than being erased by loss. The human body remained unchanged, but its decisions were guided by a longer memory. As this memory deepened, subsistence became less reactive and more adaptive. Groups adjusted to change with fewer losses. Longevity extended quietly as survival drew upon the past rather than starting anew each time. To understand how this process continued to unfold, we must look next at how subsistence and knowledge began to reshape social structure itself, creating new forms of stability that further reduced vulnerability across generations. As subsistence practices stabilized and knowledge accumulated, age itself began to take on a different role within human groups. Survival was no longer tied exclusively to physical strength or speed. Instead, it became increasingly connected to usefulness, memory, and contribution in varied forms. This shift altered how older individuals fit into the structure of daily life, and in doing so, it quietly extended the path of survival beyond early adulthood. In earlier conditions, when subsistence demanded constant exertion, those who could not keep pace faced immediate risk. Weakness translated quickly into exclusion, and exclusion often meant death. As methods of obtaining and preparing food became more efficient, effort could be distributed rather than concentrated. Groups no longer relied solely on peak physical output from every member. This redistribution reduced the penalty of aging, allowing individuals to remain integrated even as their bodies changed. Older members contributed through guidance rather than labor alone. Experience informed decisions about timing, location, and response to scarcity. This guidance reduced costly errors, indirectly protecting the group's survival. In this way, age transformed from a liability into a stabilizing force. Longevity was reinforced not by physical dominance, but by relevance. This change mattered because it altered the selective pressure acting on survival. When older individuals could remain useful, they were less likely to be abandoned during periods of stress. Care extended further across the lifespan. Survival no longer depended solely on present capacity, but on accumulated contribution. This broadened the window in which life could continue. Subsistence and social structure thus became intertwined. As food systems supported varied roles, social systems adapted to preserve them. The group benefited from keeping experienced members alive, and experienced members benefited from group support. This mutual reinforcement reduced the likelihood that age itself would trigger exclusion. 30 ceased to represent a narrowing corridor and became part of a longer trajectory of participation. These developments did not eliminate hardship. Aging still brought physical decline. Scarcity still forced difficult choices. Yet the threshold at which age became fatal shifted upward. More individuals lived long enough to pass on knowledge, reinforcing the very systems that sustained them. Longevity fed back into subsistence, and subsistence fed back into longevity. What is notable is that this shift required no explicit valuation of long life. Humans did not decide that elders should live longer. They simply retained what worked. Groups that preserved experience survived better than those that did not. Over time, this practical advantage reshaped survival patterns without altering human intention. As age extended, the structure of daily life changed again. With more individuals living beyond early adulthood, continuity increased, knowledge deepened, subsistence became more adaptive. Each extension of survival strengthened the conditions that allowed further extension. Longevity emerged as a cumulative effect rather than a goal. By the end of this phase, living past 30 was no longer an anomaly defined by chance alone. It had become supported by subsistence systems that valued experience alongside strength. The human body had not changed, but its social environment had adjusted to carry it further. This completes the role of subsistence in the slow expansion of human longevity. Survival had become sustainable across a wider range of ages, not because life was safer, but because it was structured to include more forms of contribution. To understand how longevity continued to grow beyond this point, we must now turn to the deeper transformations that followed. When stability hardened into long-term patterns that reshaped human existence at its core. As subsistence stabilized and age became less exclusionary, human life began to settle into longer patterns that extended beyond individual experience. Survival was no longer shaped only by immediate conditions or short-term adaptation. Instead, it started to reflect continuity across generations. This continuity did not arise from conscious planning for the distant future, but from the accumulation of practices that worked well enough to persist. With fewer lives ending abruptly, knowledge and behavior gained time to mature. Groups no longer reinvented survival with each generation. Lessons learned through hardship remained present, shaping decisions long after the original circumstances had passed. This persistence reduced repeated loss, as mistakes that once claimed lives were less likely to be repeated. Longevity benefited from this restraint, as fewer lives were cut short by avoidable error. Stability also altered how humans related to uncertainty. When survival extended across longer spans, the future became something that could be imagined, even if vaguely. This imagination did not take the form of long-term planning in the modern sense. It appeared instead as caution, patience, and gradual adjustment. Decisions favored continuity over immediate gain. Risk was assessed not only for the present moment, but for its impact on what might follow. These shifts changed how stress accumulated within the body. In a world dominated by constant crisis, stress remains acute and relentless. As stability increased, stress became episodic rather than continuous. Bodies recovered more fully between hardships. Chronic exhaustion diminished. Over time, this reduction in cumulative strain supported longer survival, even without improvements in medical knowledge or technology. The rhythm of life itself slowed. Days and seasons still demanded effort, but not every moment required maximum output. This pacing preserved energy and reduced wear. Aging became less abrupt, allowing individuals to remain functional longer. Longevity emerged not as an extension of life's end, but as a smoothing of life's middle. Social structure reinforced this process. Stable groups maintained norms that favored preservation over risk. Behaviors that endangered continuity were quietly discouraged, while those that supported endurance persisted. These norms were rarely articulated. They lived in routine, shaping choices without explicit instruction. survival improved as behavior aligned more closely with long-term viability. Importantly, this phase did not mark the arrival of comfort or security. Life remained constrained by environment and resource availability, yet the absence of constant disruption allowed endurance to express itself more fully. Age accumulated quietly, supported by a world that no longer reset itself with each crisis. As stability deepened, living past 30 ceased to feel exceptional within these contexts. It became part of an unfolding pattern rather than a rare outcome. This shift did not announce itself. No threshold was crossed. Survival simply continued more often. This stage represents a critical transition in the story of human longevity. Survival had moved beyond immediate reaction and into sustained existence. The human body had not changed, but the conditions surrounding it had become more accommodating of continuity. To understand how this stability continued to develop, and how it further reduced the randomness that once governed life, we must examine how long-term patterns of living began to shape human experience in deeper and more lasting ways. As stability extended across generations, it began to shape not only how humans survived, but how they behaved within that survival. Actions were no longer guided solely by immediate necessity. Gradually, patterns emerged that favored restraint, repetition, and moderation. These patterns did not arise from moral reflection or abstract foresight. They formed because behaviors that preserved continuity tended to outlast those that exhausted it. When life was short and unpredictable, risk-taking carried little long-term cost. In such conditions, urgency often outweighed caution. As survival lengthened, however, the consequences of behavior stretched further into the future. Injuries that once ended a life outright now lingered. Exhaustion accumulated. The cost of repeated strain became more visible over time. In response, behavior shifted quietly toward conservation. This shift was not uniform or deliberate. It emerged through selection of practice rather than conscious choice. Groups that moved too aggressively, exploited resources too quickly, or ignored signs of depletion suffered losses that others learned to avoid. Over time, moderation proved more survivable than intensity. Longevity favored those who did not push their bodies and environments beyond recovery. Daily rhythms adjusted accordingly. Effort was distributed more evenly across time. Rest became part of survival rather than a luxury. Activities followed sequences that balanced exertion with recovery. These rhythms preserved strength and reduced cumulative damage. Aging slowed not because hardship disappeared, but because it was no longer constant. This behavioral moderation also affected social interaction. Conflict, while never absent, became more costly in stable communities. Disruption threatened continuity. As a result, mechanisms for reducing friction emerged organically. Cooperation, patience, and predictability were reinforced because they supported endurance. Survival benefited from reduced internal strain as much as from external stability. As these behaviors persisted, they reshaped how age was experienced. Individuals who lived longer were not necessarily those who avoided danger entirely, but those who navigated it with restraint. Experience taught limits. Survival rewarded those who respected them. Longevity thus became aligned with behavior as much as with environment. Importantly, this alignment did not require conscious awareness of aging or lifespan. People did not behave cautiously because they wished to live longer. They behaved cautiously because such behavior reduced immediate loss. Longevity emerged as a side effect of living in ways that preserved continuity. As moderation spread, survival patterns shifted again. Fewer lives were lost to exhaustion, repeated injury, or preventable conflict. Age accumulated more smoothly. 30 became less of a threshold marked by attrition and more of a point along a longer trajectory shaped by sustained balance. This stage reveals how longevity is intertwined with behavior shaped by stability. When life extends, the cost of excess increases. Survival begins to favor those who endure rather than those who expend. This quiet recalibration of behavior further reduced the randomness that once governed human life. To see how this process continued, and how stability deepened beyond behavior into more structured forms of existence, we must look next at how long-term patterns hardened into systems that reshaped human environments and expectations more permanently. As moderation and continuity became embedded in behavior, they gradually solidified into structures that shaped daily life more permanently. What had once existed as flexible habits began to harden into expectations. Survival was no longer negotiated anew with each generation. Instead, it unfolded within patterns that were already in place. Patterns that reduced uncertainty before it could exert pressure on the body. These structures were not formal institutions. They appeared as routines repeated often enough to feel inevitable. Paths were taken because they were always taken. Resources were managed because they always had been. Roles were assumed because experience suggested where each person belonged. This quiet ordering of life reduced friction and preserved energy, allowing survival to extend without drawing attention to itself. With structure came predictability at a deeper level. Decisions required less deliberation. Responses to stress followed familiar sequences. When hardship arrived, groups did not improvise entirely. They relied on established ways of coping. This reliance reduced error and preserved strength, lowering the chance that crisis would escalate into collapse. As life became structured, time itself gained coherence. Days followed rhythms that balanced effort and recovery. Seasons guided expectation rather than surprise. This coherence mattered because it reduced cumulative strain. Bodies aged within a framework that supported maintenance rather than constant repair. Longevity benefited from this sustained alignment between effort and rest. Structure also altered how individuals moved through different stages of life. Transitions became less abrupt. Aging did not force sudden withdrawal from participation. Instead, roles adjusted gradually. Experience replaced exertion. Guidance replaced labor. This gradual shift preserved social integration, allowing individuals to remain supported even as physical capacity changed. This integration mattered because exclusion remained one of the greatest threats to survival. Structured life reduced the likelihood that age alone would isolate individuals. As long as contribution remained possible, survival remained shared. 30. Once a fragile threshold, became simply another point along a continuum shaped by participation rather than endurance alone. Importantly, these structures did not eliminate risk. They constrained it. Danger still existed, but it was encountered within a framework that limited its reach. Fewer lives were lost to chaos. More survived long enough to pass through multiple stages of life. Longevity expanded quietly, embedded in the architecture of daily existence. This stage represents the moment when survival ceased to be episodic and became sustained. Life no longer hinged solely on isolated acts of endurance. It flowed within systems that absorbed shock and distributed effort. Age accumulated as part of this flow, rather than in opposition to it. By the close of this phase, living past 30 was no longer defined primarily by chance. The human body remained unchanged, but the world it inhabited had become more accommodating of continuity. Longevity emerged not as an extension of life's limits, but as a consequence of living within patterns that reduced unnecessary loss. This completes the role of long-term stability in the story of human longevity. Survival had transitioned from reaction to continuity, from habit to structure. To understand how this process carried forward into even deeper transformations, we must now turn to the next stage, where stability began to reshape environments and expectations in ways that would further extend human life. As life became structured and continuity replaced constant reaction, an unusual consequence emerged. Longevity advanced without being noticed. No one paused to mark the moment when humans began living longer. There was no generation that felt suddenly extended. Survival changed too slowly, too quietly, to register as transformation. Age accumulated not as an event, but as a background condition. This invisibility is central to understanding why longevity appears elusive in historical memory. When changes unfold gradually, they fail to trigger awareness. Each individual life still contained illness, injury, and loss. Hardship remained present. From within, lived experience, nothing felt radically improved. Yet, across many lives, survival patterns were shifting. More people reached adulthood. More continued beyond it. The curve bent, even though no one felt it bend. Longevity did not announce itself because it did not alter daily perception. They simply survived what others before them might not have. The extension of life occurred between generations, not within them. Each life felt normal to itself, even as the average quietly drifted upward. This gradualism masked change. When mortality declines slowly, it is experienced as continuity rather than improvement. Death remains familiar. Loss still occurs. The absence of catastrophe is rarely noticed. What disappears first are the extremes, the sudden collapses that once dominated survival. Their absence creates no event, only a quieter landscape. The invisibility of longevity also stems from how humans perceive time. We notice sharp transitions, not slow gradients. Survival improved through marginal reductions in risk, each too small to command attention. Fewer fatal infections, more recoveries, slightly better nourishment. These shifts accumulated silently, leaving no clear boundary between before and after. Historical records, where they exist, further obscure this process. Written history tends to capture events, not distributions. It records wars, famines, and rulers, not the absence of early death. Longevity advanced in the spaces between such records, within ordinary lives that left little trace. The story of living past 30 unfolded largely outside documentation. This explains why modern observers often search for a cause that does not exist. There was no single innovation that unlocked longer life. No turning point when humans crossed a threshold. Longevity emerged as an outcome of stabilization rather than invention. It was the result of fewer interruptions, not greater achievements. As a result, age expanded without ceremony. 30 lost its fragility, not because it was redefined, but because fewer lives ended before reaching it. 40 and 50 followed the same pattern. Each extension arrived quietly, normalized by daily experience. Longevity became part of the background, not a subject of reflection. This invisibility also meant that humans did not initially adapt their expectations to longer life. Social structures lagged behind survival patterns. Roles, responsibilities, and assumptions were shaped by older conditions, even as life extended beyond them. This mismatch would later create new tensions. But at this stage, it simply underscored how unnoticed the change had been. To understand why living past 30 feels obvious to us now, yet invisible in its emergence, we must sit with this quietness. Longevity did not rise through intention or awareness. It crept forward beneath perception, carried by structure, continuity, and reduced loss. In the next stage, we will examine how this invisibility shaped human understanding of age itself, and why longer life was lived before it was ever recognized. As longevity advanced quietly, human perception of age failed to keep pace with lived reality. Expectations about life were shaped by conditions that no longer fully applied, yet they persisted through habit and memory. People continued to organize their lives around assumptions formed in shorter, harsher worlds, even as survival extended beyond those assumptions. This delay in recognition created a subtle mismatch between how long humans lived and how they understood that length. For generations, age had been associated with fragility and uncertainty. Reaching adulthood had once been an achievement. Living beyond it carried no guarantee. As more individuals began to survive into later years, these older meanings did not immediately dissolve. Age continued to be viewed through the lens of risk rather than continuity. Longevity was lived, but not conceptualized. This mismatch shaped behavior and social roles. Responsibilities were often assigned early, reflecting expectations of limited time. Experience accumulated faster than roles adapted to contain it. Individuals who lived longer found themselves inhabiting stages of life that had no clear precedent. Age extended into spaces that had not yet been defined. Because longevity emerged gradually, each generation inherited expectations from the one before it. Parents raised children according to models formed under different survival patterns. Elders judged age through memories shaped by earlier loss. These inherited frameworks lagged behind reality, reinforcing the invisibility of change. Life felt familiar even as it quietly lengthened. The absence of measurement further obscured this shift. Without consistent records, survival was understood anecdotally rather than statistically. Individual cases did not signal transformation. One person living longer than expected appeared as an exception rather than evidence of a broader trend. Only when many such exceptions accumulated did the pattern begin to emerge, and even then, recognition was slow. This lag between survival and awareness had important consequences. It meant that longevity did not immediately reshape social structure. Systems evolved to support longer life before they were consciously designed for it. Care, cooperation, and stability expanded organically, driven by necessity rather than foresight. Humans adapted to longer life without realizing they were doing so. Age, therefore, remained a relative concept. 30, 40, or 50 did not carry fixed meanings. They were understood in relation to visible vulnerability rather than chronological count. As survival extended, age lost some of its urgency. But this loss was felt rather than articulated. Life simply continued. This quiet continuation explains why longer life did not initially produce celebration or reflection. Longevity was not experienced as gain. It was experienced as absence, the absence of early death, the absence of abrupt endings. Only much later, when survival had extended far enough to strain inherited expectations, did awareness begin to catch up. The recognition that humans were living longer required comparison across generations, a perspective unavailable to individuals living within the transition itself. Until then, longevity remained an unspoken background condition. Understanding this delay helps clarify why the emergence of longer life appears sudden in hindsight. What feels like a leap was, in reality, the accumulation of many unnoticed shifts. Age expanded first in practice, then in perception. Humans lived longer before they ever realized they were doing so. To grasp how this growing awareness eventually reshaped human understanding of life and time, we must next explore how longevity began to influence memory, responsibility, and the transmission of experience across increasingly extended lives. As awareness of longer life slowly began to surface, it did so without clarity or certainty. Humans did not suddenly recognize that longevity had arrived. Instead, they noticed its consequences indirectly. Memory stretched further back. Responsibilities accumulated rather than turning over quickly. Relationships lasted longer than before. These changes hinted at extended survival without naming it explicitly. With more individuals living into later adulthood, continuity deepened in subtle ways. Communities carried experience not only through tradition, but through people who had lived it. This presence altered how decisions were made. favoring caution informed by lived outcomes rather than immediate impulse. As memory extended, the rhythm of life adjusted again. Events were understood within longer narratives. Mistakes were remembered longer. Successes informed future choices more reliably. Survival benefited from this extended perspective, as fewer errors were repeated and fewer risks were taken blindly. Longevity reinforced itself by expanding the time horizon over which experience operated. This growing awareness did not manifest as celebration. It arrived as weight. Longer life brought extended responsibility, prolonged care, and deeper attachment. Loss did not vanish. It lingered. Survival carried emotional continuity alongside physical endurance. Aging became not just a biological process, but a social and psychological one, shaped by memory and expectation. Importantly, this recognition remained partial. Humans sensed that life extended further, but lacked frameworks to fully understand or measure it. Age categories remained fluid. Roles adapted unevenly. Some structures stretched to accommodate longer lives, while others strained under outdated assumptions. Longevity was felt before it was understood. This partial awareness shaped behavior in complex ways. On one hand, extended memory encouraged restraint and foresight. On the other, inherited habits from shorter-lived contexts persisted. The result was a gradual recalibration rather than a clear shift. Life adjusted slowly to its own extension. As more people lived past 30, then beyond, age ceased to be marked primarily by survival itself. It became marked by accumulation. Experience layered upon experience. Identity deepened rather than resetting. This accumulation altered how humans related to time, binding past, present, and future more tightly together. Yet even at this stage, longevity did not become an explicit goal. Humans did not seek long life for its own sake. They sought continuity, meaning, and stability. Longer life emerged as a consequence of sustaining these values rather than pursuing age itself. Survival remained grounded in daily practice rather than abstract aspiration. This quiet recognition marks the completion of longevity's invisible rise. Life had extended beyond earlier limits, but without fanfare. Humans adapted to longer existence by living it, not by naming it. Age expanded within experience before it ever entered reflection. To understand how this extended life eventually reshaped human society more deliberately, we must now turn to the final stages of the story, where longevity began to influence how humans organized knowledge, responsibility, and meaning across generations, and how living past 30 became not only common, but foundational to what it meant to be human. When living past 30 became more common, it did not announce itself as a milestone. It appeared instead as a quiet normalization. What had once been uncertain gradually became expected, not because danger disappeared, but because fewer lives were interrupted before reaching that point. Survival extended far enough that age itself began to lose its earlier sense of rarity. This shift altered the texture of daily life. When more individuals reached adulthood and continued beyond it, continuity became visible within communities. Families included multiple generations living at the same time. Experience accumulated within living memory rather than being lost between generations. The presence of older adults became ordinary rather than exceptional. As a result, age 30 stopped functioning as a fragile threshold. It no longer marked the narrowing of survival, but the continuation of it. The risks that once clustered heavily before that age had thinned. Childhood and early adulthood, while still vulnerable, no longer determined survival as decisively as before. Life unfolded along a longer arc, shaped by endurance rather than attrition. This normalization reshaped expectations without requiring explicit recognition. People planned implicitly for futures that extended beyond early adulthood. Responsibilities were distributed across longer spans of life. Skills developed with the assumption that they would be used over many years rather than only briefly. Longevity began to structure behavior quietly, through assumption rather than intention. The commonness of living past 30 also altered how loss was perceived. Death remained present, but it occurred later and less frequently in early life. This delay changed the emotional landscape of survival. Bonds lasted longer, attachments deepened, memory extended across shared experience rather than being cut short repeatedly. Life gained continuity, not through the absence of death, but through its postponement. Importantly, this stage did not create uniform longevity. Many lives were still lost to disease, injury, or hardship. Survival remained uneven. Yet the balance had shifted. More individuals reached ages where endurance rather than vulnerability defined daily existence. 30 became part of an expected lifespan rather than a point of uncertainty. This expectation reinforced itself over time. As more people lived longer, social structures adjusted to accommodate them. Roles expanded. Knowledge transmission slowed, deepened, and became more deliberate. Experience was no longer compressed into youth. It unfolded across decades. The normalization of longevity also changed how humans related to time. Life was no longer dominated by immediacy alone. Reflection became possible. Memory connected past decisions to present outcomes. This connection reduced repeated error and supported sustained survival. Longevity became embedded in how life was lived, not merely how long it lasted. This phase marks a subtle but profound transition. Living past 30 was no longer notable. It became the baseline from which further life unfolded. Survival had crossed from rarity into expectation, without ever crossing a visible boundary. To understand how this commonness continued to shape human society, we must now examine how extended life began to influence responsibility, planning, and the organization of meaning across longer lifespans, and how longevity itself became a foundation rather than an outcome. As living past 30 became expected rather than exceptional, responsibility began to stretch across a longer span of life. Survival was no longer concentrated in the urgency of early years alone. Instead, it unfolded through extended phases of contribution, care, and accountability. This extension quietly reshaped how humans understood their place within the group and the time they occupied within it. When life was short, responsibility arrived early and ended abruptly. Skills were learned quickly. Roles were assumed with little preparation. Experience was compressed into narrow windows. As longevity increased, these pressures eased. Learning could occur gradually. Mastery replaced improvisation. Individuals carried responsibilities for longer, allowing knowledge and judgment to deepen through repetition rather than haste. This deepening altered how effort was distributed across a lifetime. Energy was no longer expended solely to survive the present. It was conserved to sustain participation over time. Risk-taking declined not because courage diminished, but because the cost of loss increased. A longer life made injury, conflict, and exhaustion more consequential. Survival favored those who preserved themselves for continued contribution. Extended responsibility also reshaped social bonds. This reciprocity strengthened continuity, ensuring that vulnerability at later stages of life did not automatically lead to exclusion. Longevity was reinforced by networks of mutual obligation that extended beyond immediate survival. As more individuals lived longer, planning emerged implicitly. Humans did not yet plan for old age as a distinct stage, but they behaved in ways that assumed continuity. Resources were managed with an eye toward future use. Knowledge was preserved rather than expended quickly. Decisions favored stability over short-term gain. These behaviors further reduced the randomness that once governed survival. This shift also influenced how humans understood consequence. Actions taken earlier in life now echoed further into the future. Mistakes lingered. Successes compounded. Experience gained weight, Longevity deepened the connection between cause and effect, encouraging caution and foresight without requiring explicit calculation. Importantly, this transformation did not eliminate hardship. Life remained fragile. Loss continued to occur, yet the structure of survival changed. Responsibility extended, and with it, the opportunity for sustained influence. Individuals mattered for longer, and that duration shaped behavior in return. The growing commonness of living past 30 thus created a new dynamic. Survival was no longer merely about reaching adulthood. It was about remaining engaged beyond it. Longevity became meaningful not as added years, but as extended relevance. Life was valued not for its length alone, but for what could be carried forward within it. This stage represents a critical recalibration in human existence. Survival had moved from being a narrow passage into being a long corridor. Responsibility filled that corridor, shaping how humans acted within extended time. Longevity became both a condition and a constraint, guiding behavior toward continuity. To see how this extended responsibility ultimately reshaped human understanding of meaning, memory, and purpose, we must now move to the final stage of the story, where longer life ceased to be merely common and began to define what it meant to be human across generations. As living past 30 became woven into the ordinary fabric of life, it began to reshape not only survival and responsibility, but meaning itself. When life extends, questions change. Existence is no longer defined solely by endurance. It becomes shaped by accumulation, memory, and the weight of continuity. Longevity altered what it meant to live, not by adding years, but by deepening the span across which experience mattered. In shorter lives, meaning is often immediate. Survival dominates purpose. Actions are measured by their capacity to sustain the present. As life lengthened, this immediacy softened. Individuals carried their past forward for longer, and the future stretched further ahead. Decisions acquired layers. Experience was no longer consumed quickly, it settled, influencing behavior long after the original moment had passed. This accumulation of lived time changed how humans related to memory. Events were not simply survived and forgotten. They were revisited, reflected upon, and integrated. Memory extended across decades, binding different stages of life together. Longevity allowed individuals to remain themselves across change, rather than being repeatedly reset by loss. As memory deepened, responsibility expanded again. Actions taken earlier in life shaped later outcomes more clearly. Regret, wisdom, and restraint gained space to operate. Humans began to sense that life unfolded as a connected whole, rather than a series of isolated trials. Survival was no longer just about passing thresholds. It was about carrying coherence across time. This coherence reshaped social expectation. Individuals who lived longer were expected to contribute not only labor, but judgment. Experience gained authority. Continuity became valuable. Communities relied increasingly on those who had seen change unfold slowly rather than abruptly. Longevity strengthened the role of perspective, grounding decision-making in extended observation. Importantly, this shift did not produce clarity or certainty. Longer life also brought prolonged vulnerability, extended care, and deeper exposure to loss. Aging did not remove fragility, it redistributed it across time. Longevity was not an escape from suffering, but a reconfiguration of it. Meaning emerged from endurance rather than relief. As living past 30 became unremarkable, life stages blurred. The boundary between youth and maturity softened. Identity unfolded gradually, rather than abruptly. This gradualism allowed individuals to adapt to change without being forced into sudden transitions. By this point, longevity had ceased to be merely a demographic shift. It had become a condition shaping how humans understood themselves. Life was no longer framed by its likely end, but by its unfolding middle. The question was no longer how long one might live, but how one might remain aligned with oneself across extended time. This stage completes the normalization of living past 30. What began as a quiet reduction in early loss had grown into a transformation of human experience. Survival had extended far enough to alter identity, responsibility, and meaning. Longevity was no longer something humans reached. It was something they inhabited. To bring this story to its close, we must now step back and reflect on what this slow extension of life ultimately reveals. Not about age, but about the human condition itself. In the final stage, we will consider what was gained, what was lost, and what it truly meant for humans to begin living past 30, without ever deciding to do so. Quiet transformation. It becomes clear that living past 30 was never the result of a single decision, discovery, or breakthrough. Longevity did not arrive as a gift. It appeared as a consequence of living differently, often without knowing that anything had changed at all. At no point did humans choose to extend their lives. They chose instead to reduce loss. They learned how to avoid unnecessary risk, how to recover rather than collapse, how to share burden rather than face it alone. Each of these choices addressed immediate survival, not future age. Yet together, they reshaped the arc of life itself. Age extended not because it was pursued, but because it was allowed. This perspective reframes the meaning of longevity. It is tempting to view longer life as progress, as something added to human existence. But what changed first was not duration, it was fragility. As the early interruptions of life diminished, survival flowed more smoothly across time. Longevity was revealed where life no longer broke apart as often. In this sense, living past 30 tells us less about human ambition and more about human restraint. The extension of life followed moderation, cooperation, and continuity. It followed the decision, repeated across generations, to endure rather than exhaust, to preserve rather than consume, to remain rather than rush. They simply made sudden death less frequent. Yet this gain came with complexity. As life extended, vulnerability did not vanish. It stretched. Care lasted longer. Responsibility deepened. Loss lingered. Longevity did not simplify the human condition. It expanded it. The same structures that allowed survival to continue also required humans to carry themselves across longer spans of memory, obligation, and change. This expansion altered how humans related to time. Life was no longer bounded tightly by its likely end. It unfolded as an open middle, shaped by continuity rather than urgency. Meaning emerged not from reaching an endpoint, but from remaining coherent across years. Longevity invited reflection not because life was longer, but because it was sustained. Importantly, none of this was inevitable. Longevity was not encoded as destiny. It was contingent, shaped by countless small decisions and adaptations. It could have unfolded differently. It still can. Living past 30 was not guaranteed by biology alone. It was supported by how humans treated one another, how they managed risk, and how they structured daily life. As we approach the close of this story, the question shifts once more. If longevity emerged without intention and expanded without recognition, what does it ask of us now? Not how to live longer, but how to live within longer lives. What responsibilities come with extended time? What patterns do we carry forward, and which do we need to release? The history of living past 30 is not a story of triumph over nature. It is a story of alignment with it. Humans did not conquer fragility. They learned to soften its impact. In doing so, they changed the shape of life itself, quietly and irreversibly. In the final part of this journey, We will step back from history and ask what this slow transformation ultimately reveals about being human, about the costs and gifts of endurance, and about the kind of lives we are still shaping, often without realizing it. As human life extended beyond earlier limits, it carried consequences that were neither simple nor entirely positive. Longevity did not arrive as an unambiguous gain. It reshaped the human experience by stretching both endurance and vulnerability across longer spans of time. What was once brief and intense became prolonged and complex. Living longer changed not only how long humans existed, but how they carried themselves through existence. With extended life came extended exposure. Pain lasted longer, loss lingered, responsibilities accumulated, rather than resolving quickly. When lives were shorter, hardship often ended with the life itself. As survival continued, hardship required ongoing negotiation. Longevity demanded sustained resilience rather than momentary endurance. This shift altered the emotional and psychological weight of survival. Care became a longer obligation. Communities that once supported vulnerability briefly now carried it across decades. Aging did not remove dependence. It redistributed it. The need for support appeared later, but it persisted longer. Longevity required new forms of patience, empathy, and shared responsibility, often without clear precedent. Extended life also changed how failure was experienced. Mistakes followed individuals further into the future. Choices made early echoed across years rather than fading with time. Regret gained depth. Learning slowed but deepened. The cost of error increased alongside the opportunity for correction. Longevity amplified consequence. This amplification reshaped how humans approached risk. Survival no longer rewarded reckless endurance alone. It favored balance, restraint, and adaptability. To live longer was not to avoid difficulty, but to manage it across time. Longevity asked humans to navigate change without being consumed by it. At the same time, extended life introduced new forms of fragility. Bodies aged gradually, revealing limits that had once been rarely reached. Physical decline became visible. Memory shifted. Identity adapted unevenly. Longevity exposed humans to stages of existence that earlier lives seldom encountered. These stages demanded care rather than conquest. Importantly, longevity did not distribute these burdens evenly. Inequality persisted. Some lives extended with relative stability, others with prolonged hardship. Living longer did not erase vulnerability. It magnified the conditions under which vulnerability was managed. The benefits of longevity were inseparable from the structures that supported it. As life extended, meaning became harder to compress. Purpose could no longer be fulfilled quickly. It unfolded over time, requiring revision and reassessment. Longevity asked humans not only to survive, but to remain coherent across change. Identity became a process, rather than a state. This complexity explains why longevity has always been accompanied by tension. Extended life offers continuity, but demands endurance. It allows memory, but carries loss. It preserves experience, but requires adaptation. Longevity did not simplify what it meant to be human. It expanded it. As we approach the final reflection, it becomes clear that living past 30 was never simply about living longer. It was about carrying more life within a single existence. It required humans to stretch care, responsibility, and meaning across time in ways that had not been demanded before. In the final part, we will not ask whether longevity was good or bad. We will ask what it reveals, about fragility, about endurance, and about the quiet choices that continue to shape how long and how fully humans live. When humans began living past 30 more often, nothing about the world announced that a boundary had been crossed. No celebration marked the change. No moment divided the past from the present. Life simply continued, longer than before, shaped by the same fragility and the same uncertainty, only stretched across more time. Longevity did not replace vulnerability. It carried it forward. This is what makes the history of living past 30 so revealing. It was never a story about conquering death or mastering the body. It was a story about reducing interruption, about allowing life to unfold without being cut short as often. What extended was not strength, but continuity, not certainty, but opportunity. People lived longer not because they were promised more time, but because fewer moments took it away. Survival accumulated quietly, year by year, generation by generation, without intention and without awareness. And in that quiet extension, something subtle changed in what it meant to be human. Life could be carried rather than rushed. Experience could deepen rather than reset. Responsibility could stretch rather than collapse. Identity could remain intact across change instead of being fractured by loss. Longevity did not add meaning to life. It created space for meaning to persist. Yet this space came with weight. Longer lives required longer care, longer patience, longer endurance. They asked humans not only to survive, but to remain themselves across time, to carry memory without being trapped by it, to adapt without losing coherence. Longevity did not simplify existence. It asked more of it. Seen this way, living past 30 was never the goal. It was the consequence of alignment with environment rather than opposition, alignment with others rather than isolation, alignment with limits rather than denial. Humans did not extend life by reaching further. They extended it by pressing less hard against what could break them. This history leaves us with a question that cannot be answered by science alone. If longer life emerged from reducing fragility rather than chasing duration, then the question is no longer how long humans can live, but how they choose to inhabit the time they already have. What patterns do we repeat that quietly shorten life, even when we possess the knowledge to avoid them? And which small, unremarkable adjustments might once again reshape survival, not dramatically, but decisively? Living past 30 did not happen because humans demanded more years. It happened because they learned, slowly and imperfectly, how not to lose them so quickly. And as life continues to extend in ways our ancestors never named, we are left to consider whether longevity is something we pursue or something we allow through the way we live with one another, with our limits, and with time itself.